Well, good morning and welcome to Westlake. My name is Dale, and I'm really glad that you're joining us today, whether it's online or here in the room. Especially if you're new with us today, we're glad that you have made the choice to come and join us today. And if you are relatively new to Westlake, in just 1 week, next Sunday, we have a special event just for you. It's called Welcome to Westlake. It's 30 minutes. It'll be right after service. It'll be in the cafe in the lobby where we serve coffee every morning. It's a great chance to say hello. We'd love to get to know you just a little bit and answer any questions that might be on your mind. And so if you want to be a part of that, you can either use the connection card that you might have gotten on the way in today, or just stop by the Welcome Center in the lobby today and say, hey, I'll be there next week. Well, before we start the message, I just want to say how thankful and proud I am of our church family yesterday, celebrating the life of Tony Whittle. And, Kat and Riley and Cindy, our hearts continue to be with you guys today and going forward. Also, in March 10th, we're going to have our next pitch-in dinner. So you can save the date right now. We'll get more details as we get closer. But as a church family, I think we've discovered that we like to eat together. And so we will be doing that. Yes, biscuits, please, Cheryl. Biscuits. Got it? Okay, thank you very much. Well, today we are starting a new series talking about Hall of Famers from the Bible. And we're looking at the lives of a few heroes from history. They're people who are listed in Hebrews 11. Many call that the Hall of Faith, or the Faith Hall of Fame. It's a list of people who are held up as examples of how we can live by faith. It calls out people like Noah and Abraham and Moses and many others. And here's why they're examples. In Hebrews 11, 1 and 2, we read this. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to take a dive into the lives of some of these Hall of Famers, David and Jacob and Joseph and Sarah. Now, when we think about Hall of Famers, whether it's the Bible or a Hall of Fame around us, we can assume that the people are perfect, especially if they're in the Faith Hall of Fame. They must have lived a perfect life. Well, what we're going to find out is that they were far from perfect people. But they're people who, by faith, continued to pursue God. And because of their faith, God did some pretty incredible things in their lives and through their lives. And today we're going to start with David, a great king of Israel. If you have your Bible or app with you today, I'd invite you to join me in the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 7. Have you ever experienced a significant setback in life? I think we all have. I certainly have. When I was in the business world about 20 years ago, in one of my many midlife crises, I decided we should move to the country. And we had never lived in the country before, but we set about looking for a place where we could have a small hobby farm. And we spent about a year looking. We would see houses, and they'd either be way out of our price range or just, not conducive to what we wanted to do. And after that year of searching, we found 25 acres that was just about perfect. Now, it was headed towards an auction, so we had to move fast. And so with no clue of what was ahead, we bought the land and started dreaming of what it could be. We had a good friend who was a general contractor, and we loved their house, and we asked him to build our house, and he said, well, here's a little secret. My house is a modular house that I finished, and so I'd recommend you do that. And we thought, all right, this is great. We've got a strong recommendation from someone in the business, and so we went to that very same modular home company and signed a contract and began the work to get the site prepared. So of course, when you order a home that way, you make a down payment, and then you've paid for the land, and you start clearing the land, and you start building a foundation, and the bills add up pretty quickly, but that's okay. You keep in mind what's going to be ahead. And at first, everything seemed great. But then, the project schedule started to slip a little bit. Now, I managed several large construction projects, and so that was no surprise, no cause for panic. It's what happens sometimes. And so we just went on and moved ahead, and just at the time that the foundation was getting ready and they could have delivered the house, and we were calling the factory, and they were kind of unsure of the delivery date, we read in the newspaper that the modular home company went bankrupt. And so it took about a month of calling them, calling the bank, calling government officials, trying to find out what was going on, calling the law firm that represented them. And after a month, it became painfully clear what our situation was. We were not getting a house from them, and beyond that, we were not getting our money back from them. That was a pretty significant setback. The bank, they weren't the best partner. They said, well, sorry for your loss, but that's on you, not on us. We all have significant setbacks in life, and they take different forms, and they come from different places. Some of them are circumstantial, some of them are self-inflicted, and some of them are caused by others. And, like so many setbacks, our story was a combination of those. Without the Great Recession of 2008, probably none of that would have happened. The modular home company, they could have been a lot more clear about what their business prospects were. And, we probably could have done a better job protecting ourselves with a better contract. So, in life, we often think that everything should just be up and to the right. The graph just keeps climbing, and it looks great, whether that's financially with our bank account, our retirement fund, our net worth, or our careers. That could be grades in school, our job reviews, or maybe advancing in the company, progressive promotions, or our family. Everything should always be growing and getting better. Friends and relationships, they should always be growing stronger and not falling apart. But that's not realistic. Despite what anyone would try to have you believe on their social media page, no one has their life all together. No one's life is perfect. No one has their ducks perfectly in a row all the time. It just doesn't happen. Life is a roller coaster. It goes up, it goes down, it has twists, it has turns, and really our faith is no different. Living a life of faith, we can assume it should just go up and to the right, but that's really not what happens. Yes, over time it does, but there are times of significant breakthrough and growth, and there are some challenging times as well. But what we're going to see as we work through the life of David, it is how we respond to the setbacks that really determines the depth of our faith. Now, David he's a central character in the entire Bible. Just doing a quick search in a Bible app for David, over 1,000 references to David in the Bible. We're introduced to him in the book of 1 Samuel, and then the rest of that book, 2 Samuel, that's all about David's life. We get a window into who David was because he wrote a lot of the book of Psalms. We get to know his heart. And, even people who may not know much about the Bible, probably somewhere along the line they've heard David's words in the 23rd Psalm. And so David is featured in the Bible. He's in Hebrews 11. He's in the Hall of Fame. And what we'll see is that he lived a roller coaster of a life, just like all of the Hall of Famers. And again, we might be tempted to think, because the Bible holds them up as examples, that they would be perfect. But that's not the case. David's life has ups and downs, it's significant successes. It's no stretch to say that David had some total failures in his life. And despite that, maybe because of that, he's in the Hall of Fame. Now, it's interesting with all these failures that the Bible consistently describes David as a man after God's own heart. Not just in the Old Testament, but in Acts 13, Paul is introducing Jesus in a Jewish synagogue. He's introducing who Jesus is, and he starts with David. In Acts 13, Paul writes this: after removing Saul, he made David their king. He's talking about God, who had King Saul, replaced him with David. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. And from this man's descendants, God has brought to Israel the Savior Jesus as he promised. And so David is not just some historical figure from the Old Testament, but he is used by Paul as Paul shares the good news of Jesus. God himself also has some very powerful words that he speaks about David. We find some of this in 2 Samuel chapter 7. David has done a lot. God has done a lot through David. He's reconciled the kingdom. He's bringing peace. He's conquered most of the major enemies and establishing Jerusalem as the capital. And here's what God tells his prophet to tell David. Starting in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 8. Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I've been with you wherever you have gone, and I've cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them, so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. God then speaks to David about his family. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I'll punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Now that's a pretty powerful promise from God. But again, David is anything but perfect. You know, he is a Hall of Famer not because of his own abilities and what he accomplished, but because of what God accomplished through him. And this roller coaster of life. And from David's roller coaster, we can learn some truths from the Hall of Famers. The first is this: Hall of Famers are not obvious. When David was a boy, no one would have ever suspected he would grow up to be king. Israel already had a king, King Saul. Saul got a little full of himself, and God said, you know what, we need a different family here. And so he sends his prophet Samuel. He says, go to the land of Jesse, and one of Jesse's sons, I'm going to have you anoint him as the next king of Israel. And so he goes, and he meets with Jesse and his sons, and this is how it goes in 1 Samuel 16. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And it's not just Samuel. Jesse doesn't even consider that his youngest son might be an option. In fact, it's only when he's pressed that he admits that he has a son named David. And so even to his own family, David is not the obvious choice. And that can show up in our lives too. People can think, sometimes they even tell us, things that make us believe that we're not Hall of Fame material, or that God could never use us. But the reality is that God is still writing our story. The ending is usually not obvious. If we look at how God works, it seems that he loves a shocking plot twist in the story. So don't write yourself out of the story. God is far from done. The second thing that we learn is that Hall of Famers are made, they're not born. David's life was the complete opposite of entitlement. He was the family shepherd. He had the worst job. He was isolated. He was out there on his own. He had to care for animals that weren't very bright. He had to fight off wild animals like lions with just a staff. He had to learn how to depend on God when there was no one else around. That was important training for David. And while he was still a boy, the giant Goliath begins to taunt the Israelite army. No one else has the guts to go out and fight him. But David says, you know what? I'll do that. They think they're sending David out to get slaughtered. But he wins a surprising victory with God's help. He becomes a national hero, but then he's chased away. He goes from being a national hero to a political refugee. He has to go hide out in caves. And his character is tested throughout his life. After he defeats Goliath, Saul invites David to live in the palace with him. And David serves Saul. He does it faithfully. But there are multiple instances where Saul tries to kill him. He hurls spears at David while he's sitting there playing the harp. And what does David do? He just dodges the spear and he moves on with life. And then when he becomes a refugee, Saul spends a long time trying to hunt David down and kill him. And David's really tested in that time. In fact, there's a moment where Saul is vulnerable and exposed, and David could have easily taken his life, but he lets him live. You see, rather than being crushed by adversity, David was shaped by it. And we all have that choice because we all have adversity in life, and it can crush us or feel like it wants to crush us at times, but the choice is ours. Rather than being crushed by adversity, if we allow it to shape us instead, for God to do what only he can do in those dark times of life. That's how David developed the skills and the character that he needed. The third thing that we see from David's life is that the journey is far from easy. Hall of Famers don't have an easy journey. Character is not formed in prosperity. Character is forged in adversity. And that's what happened in David's life. In order to develop the character, the fortitude that he needed to be the king that God wanted for his people, David had to live in adversity. He didn't just briefly visit adversity. He lived in it for years. Running from Saul taught him some valuable lessons about trusting people, about how to live, about what it feels like to have someone come after you. He learned about things like treachery, about what it feels like to be a hunted man. And that was important because David's character had to be forged through that. Because David was going to step into leadership. And he wasn't just given people to lead. While he's on the run, this unlikely band comes around him. They're not easy people. And David, they see him as their leader. And so David doesn't get handed the finest army in the world. He gets handed a ragtag bunch. And he has to learn how to lead. And they step up and they become not just an effective fighting force, but a force of people who are going to protect and serve others. You see, what David learned is that in life, we can't wait for the ideal circumstance. Someone didn't hand it to him. He had to learn how to overcome obstacles with God's help. You know, Peyton Manning is known as a Hall of Famer. He played 18 seasons, 11 of them, or 14 of them here in Indianapolis. And, you know, people widely credit him with being the key person who transformed the Colts into playoff contenders and led them to a Super Bowl championship. He achieved at the highest levels. He's considered one of the greatest QBs of all times. But in 2011, he underwent 2 neck surgeries because he could no longer throw the ball effectively. He's won the Super Bowl, and now he can't even throw a football. And during that surgery and the rehab, he lost significant arm strength. He had to start all over. Didn't matter about his former success. He had to reteach himself how to throw a football. He held clandestine practices so that no one could see how bad it was. In fact, Business Insider reported that the first time he tried throwing a football after his second surgery was with Colorado Rockies first baseman Todd Helton in the summer of 2011. They did it in a batting cage under the Rockies stadium so that no one could see. Helton took up a position about 10 yards away and held out his hands. Manning reared back and threw. The ball nosedived after 5 yards, Manning said. It didn't even make it halfway to Helton before it hit the ground. Helton burst out laughing. He thought Manning was joking. "Come on, man," he said, "throw the ball." And Manning said, "I wish I could." Where did he go from there? He went back to win the Super Bowl again, just 2 years later. You see, Hall of Famers, they're not handed what they get. They learn how to fight through adversity. They have to learn to overcome because the journey is not easy. And to live with faith, David had to learn to depend on God, not himself. And finally, we see that Hall of Famers are not perfect. We look at what God said in him, and you could easily get the impression that David was perfect, but that is far, far from the truth. David, there's no kind way to say it, he messed up big time, several times in his life. There was an incident where he wanted another man's wife so bad that he had her brought to the palace and, used his position of authority to force himself on her. She ended up being pregnant after that, and so he tried to lure her husband back so that there would be a cover story. That didn't work, so he ended up lying and having her husband, who was one of his army commanders, had him killed in battle, set him up so that he knew that he would be killed. That's not perfect. Far from it. He failed some of his children. He had a son who raped a daughter, leading that son to be murdered by another son. That sets off a tragic course of events in their lives and in the family, and it extends into the nation. It's not just the family that's estranged. One of those sons comes back and leads an uprising against David, and that sets the future division of the kingdom of Israel into motion. In his later days, David became self-reliant. He thought it was about him and about the strength that had been gathered in Israel. And so he goes off and he does a census. It's not just some innocent thing to try to figure out how to administer the kingdom more effectively, but no, he's trying to number his strength and say, look what we can depend on. And that leads to a great tragedy and a lot of pain for the nation. How in the world does someone who has inflicted that much pain and tragedy on other people end up in the Hall of Fame? How does that happen? It's the same way, actually, that we live our life with God. I am far from perfect. None of us are perfect. We all mess up to one degree or another. Here's what we learned. Every time David messed up, every time he sinned, he turned back to God. He just humbly turned back to God. And by God's grace, he was redeemed from those failures. Yes, there were consequences, but David was still known as a man after God's own heart. And that's where we have to begin, to continue, and to end our journey of faith. Asking God for forgiveness, seeking God's grace in our lives, depending on God to make the way even when we mess it up, maybe especially when we mess it up. You see, even though David sinned against God and he hurt and caused tremendous pain for a lot of people, he always humbly turned back to God. And that was the key. And so in your life, take an example from David. Take an example from a Hall of Famer. Here's 3 quick ways that you can embrace God's grace for yourself. 1, humbly embrace your identity. You were created by God. He made you to be his son or his daughter. He loves you. And he invites you to follow him. And when we follow him by trusting in Jesus, that becomes our primary identity as a child of God. You can't lose that identity. It can't just fade away. It's always there. And so no matter what someone else would tell you, no matter what the world tries to tell you, no matter what the enemy tries to tell you, you can always humbly turn back to God and reclaim and restore your identity. The second thing you can do is to humbly embrace your journey. Tony Stoltzfus is a Christian life coach and an author, and one of his books is called The Calling Journey, and he maps out what life looks like. Now, we are all individuals. We don't follow an exact template, but there are general patterns in life of those who follow Christ over the long haul. Now, we don't have time today to dive deeply into this, but we're going to come back to it and go there next week. And so if you want to get a little overview, read ahead. thecallingjourney.com is a great place to get an overview, or you can read the book. And here's why I hold this up. This has been really important in my life, of learning how to not just hang on to the roller coaster of life, but how to see how God might be at work in my life through those ups and through those downs. And so we'll dive into that next week. And the third way to embrace God's grace is to humbly embrace God's possibilities, particularly God's possibility for you. There's so many times in David's life when we look at what he's done or what's happening around him, and we say, that's it. It's over. No way. Can't recover from this one. And in that, I find hope. Because there are times I look at life, or I'm walking with life in someone, or through life with someone, and they look at it and they say, no way, can't go on, can't come back from this. Embrace God's possibility. Embrace what God might be able to do. So many times, David should have been done, finished, disqualified from the race. But he perseveres. He goes on to win it. Not by his own strength, not by his own power, but by God's grace and God's possibility. And in your life, in my life, because of God's grace, God's possibilities are still alive no matter what happens. Today, we're going to celebrate communion together as we close the service. And as you came in, maybe you got one of these little prepackaged communion element sets. If you didn't, just simply raise your hand. The ushers will bring them around and hand them out. And know this, you don't have to be a member of a particular church to celebrate communion with us. If you're following Jesus or you want to follow Jesus, you are invited, urged, encouraged to celebrate with us today. And this is a way that we embrace God's grace, because it reminds us that without Jesus, there's really not a good way to navigate life. And it reminds us of the love and the sacrifice that Jesus made for each and every one of us. How he invites us to turn from all that stuff, all that junk, to say, I can't clean that up on my own. But I humbly embrace that through Jesus, God can do that. And that's where a life of faith begins. And we do this together on a regular basis because, I don't know about you, but I need to be reminded sometimes that that's how the life of faith and our journey through life continues. It's God's grace. It is the love and the sacrifice of Jesus that makes the way possible for each of us. And so as we prepare for communion today, let's pray together. God, we all look on moments of life in our own lives and say, wow, how did I get there? We can look at little things and say, no, that just doesn't seem right. Shouldn't have done that. Or we can just look at some major train wrecks and say, God, that should have wiped me out. But God, it is by your grace, it is by your invitation, it is by your love and your life that we are invited to lay those things down, to leave them behind, and to turn to you. And God, in this next moment of silence, we just take time to ask your forgiveness for those things in our life, either things that we've done or things that we should have done that we didn't do. God, we just come to you. And God, we know that we can embrace your possibility. 1 John 1:9, you make this amazing promise to us that if we confess our sins, if we ask for your forgiveness, that you don't just forgive us, but you cleanse and you purify us from all unrighteousness. Thank you, Jesus. We remember on the night of the Last Supper, Jesus was with his disciples. And after giving thanks, he took the bread and he broke it. And he said, this is my body. It's broken for you. Take this and eat in remembrance of me. And likewise, after supper, he took the cup, and after returning thanks to the Father, he said, this is my blood. It's poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. As often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me.